More on the legacy of Bill Russell. We now welcome in Jacki MacMullan. And Jacki, when you think about Bill Russell, I feel like his impact wasn't just on the court, but also outside of basketball. What were his impacts both on and off the court?
Well, Trenni, I've said this a lot in the last 24 hours. I think he's the single most significant and impactful basketball player that ever lived, and one of the most significant and impactful athletes that ever lived. And I even hesitate to say that because Bill Russell never thought of himself as an athlete. That was only a small part of his life. And never mind that he was probably the greatest rebounder that ever lived, one of the most incredible shot blockers we've ever seen, 11 championships in 13 years. No one will ever do that again. All those things aside, what always was just amazing to me was in that climate. And you're talking about the 60s and 70s. A climate which our country was very racially divided at times, and nowhere more than the city of Boston, especially during the times of busing. And yet Bill Russell had the courage and the tenacity to not talk about being an activist, but actually being one, whether it was when Medgar Evers was assassinated and Bill, after talking with Medgar's brother, went down and ran the first integrated basketball camp in Mississippi, or when Martin Luther King was assassinated and Bill's devastated that his friend is gone and he's supposed to play Wilt Chamberlain in the Philadelphia Warriors the next day in a basketball game. And his initial thought was, I'm voting not to play. I'm devastated. I don't want to play. We should honor his memory. But after talking with the commissioner of the NBA, the mayors in the other cities, they're watching live rioting on television. He had to make with a heavy-hearted decision that, no, we need to play. That would be better for my community, for our community. And then, of course, they paused the season after that for a couple of days so Bill could go down to Atlanta and march to Ebenezer Church with Martin Luther King Jr.'s family. So his impact goes so far beyond basketball. Even in the city of Boston, remember, very heavily involved in supporting the Black community during a really rugged, terrible time in our city during busing. So he had the courage of the conditions. He didn't care what you thought of him because all he cared about was what he thought was right. And if you didn't like it, too bad.
Obviously, Jacki, that was a long time ago. And for many of us, we never saw what he did off the court in some of the hardest times in the United States. Yet he still feels like someone who has transcended sports, transcended decades. So what kind of impact has he had even on today's players, maybe more so with his activism than anything else?
I think one of the most underrated things about him, Trenni, was he is literally the OG of the NBA, for real. And he had a connection with 4 or 5 generations of, I'm talking about NBA superstars, the best of the best. When Julius Erving is an underclassman at UMass, it's Bill Russell that goes up to give a speech at the school and then takes Julius out for 3.5 hours afterwards and never once mentions basketball. He's talking about the responsibility to pay your knowledge and your activism forward, to stand up as a Black man in this country and to fight for the rights of your people, to talk about education, how know where the library is. You're not here just to play basketball. All the things except for basketball. He did the same thing with a young Llewellyn Cinder, calls him up when he's at UCLA and says, hey, we're going to this thing called the Cleveland Summit, and you're going to come with me. And so many examples of that going forward. Kobe Bryant told me these great stories about, he used to talk with Bill for hours about the art of war and how Bill would convince Wilt Chamberlain after a game was in hand, and he'd let Wilt score a bunch of points in the fourth quarter so that Wilt would walk away feeling as though he was satisfied with his play. And, all these kind of things that the players that went to check in with Bill and to learn from him, it's a list that's too lengthy to mention. LeBron James, Kevin Garnett, you've seen some great clips about the interview that Bill and Kevin Garnett did together. It just, it gives you goosebumps. And so I know that the reason his legacy is intact and is still, and everybody's so emotional today is because, he hasn't played since 1969. And yet his presence has been felt all the way through, right up to the day he died. How many people can say that?
Yeah, he was an incredible man. And I know he had a complicated relationship, Jacki, with this city. I remember his daughter at one point saying he loved the Celtics, playing for the Celtics. He didn't always love playing for Boston. What was his relationship with Boston, and what's his legacy here?
Well, I mean, again, I was just a kid when he was actually playing here, but I've certainly interviewed enough people about it, talked to Bill about it, read about it. Think about it, Trenni. So here's this Boston Celtics organization, the most progressive basketball organization ever. First black player drafted, first starting five, first black head coach, which, by the way, was Bill Russell. So here's Red Auerbach and Bill Russell collaborating in an incredible way. You know, the model for diversity and inclusion and getting along. And yet, as a backdrop, you have this city that's at odds. I mean, I remember ML Carr telling me that, you know, he came to Boston and one of the first photographs he saw was a black man getting stabbed by an American flag for many, many years. That's how people viewed Boston. Now, Bill didn't care. Bill was going to stand up for what was right. And so that's why he supported the black community during that horrible time. And as a result, the people that were cheering for him on Friday night, on Saturday night, were breaking into his home and defecating on his bed and smearing feces on his wall. And people wonder why he didn't want his number retired. Are you kidding me? And so to me, it's so obvious. And yet people, you know, everybody wants their superstars to be put in a box, right? And we want to love them for what they do on the court. We forget about them as human beings. And Bill Russell, well beyond being a basketball player, was a human being that cared about everybody around him, not just on the basketball court, but in the world that we lived in. And so it is complicated. You know, the statute took too long, but that's because he didn't want it. You know, his Hall of Fame induction, all those things. He was a man of principle. And if he felt like you didn't believe in him, why on earth should he believe in you?
Yeah, Jack, I have goosebumps listening to you talk about Bill Russell. I wish we had more time. Thank you so much for giving us an insight into more so the person he was than just the basketball player.
Oh, he was a wonderful man. I will miss him. I cherish the little bit of time that I had spent with him for sure.